Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first chapter in human development, child development. And this is just a chapter that's going to give you a prelude to generally what it is that we're going to be studying throughout this course. This is going to focus early on, we're going to focus on child development, but we are going to go all the way through the life course, all the way up until death. But child development, excuse me, oh, excuse me, sorry, um, is the scientific study of patterns and growth, change, and stability that occurs from conception through adolescence. And the bulk of the course is going to focus on the time period of human development from conception until adolescence, the end of adolescence into the late teens. We will, of course, also be covering adulthood, old age, and death and dying, but we're going to spend probably the bulk of the class from birth until the early 20s. So, knowledge of this information is meant to improve the careers of people who are seeking to work with children in order, especially in the medical field, to understand how to engage with children or in other fields like early education. You have to understand development so that you understand what children are capable of cognitively at each stage and how that's going to impact behavior and understanding and decisions that they make. Okay, so we're going to focus on what periods have change and growth versus what periods in development have stability and how this dynamic push and pull between change and growth impacts behavior. So specific areas of child development that we are going to focus on include physical development, cognitive development, social development, and personality development. Physical development is going to examine the way in which the brain, the muscles, the nervous system, senses, need for sleep, and need for nutrition all impact behavior at different stages of development. Cognitive development is going to focus on understanding how growth and change in intellectual capabilities influence human behavior, influence a child's behavior, what they're capable of understanding at different stages, which is going to dictate what they're capable of physically doing in terms of behavior. Social development is the way in which interactions with others and their relationships grow, change, or remain stable over the course of life. We're going to be looking at relationships, excuse me, in all stages of life, from birth and all the way through to death. Um, and finally, personality development. Okay, and personality development is the study of stability or change in the enduring characteristics that differentiate one person from another. Just a note on personality development, the bulk of that happens from birth through adolescence. It's not that our personalities don't change, we do grow, we get wiser, we get experience, we make decisions a little bit differently, but we're going to see the most dynamic time and the most dynamic changes in personality occur between birth and the end of adolescence. So, focusing again on child development, it's broken into specific categories of age groups. And the first is going to be the prenatal period. That development literally starts from the point of conception. And there's a ton of development that's going on prenatally in the womb. The prenatal period is literally from conception until the point of birth, until the baby leaves the birth canal and enters the world. Infancy to toddlerhood is the time period that occurs from the minute they come into the world until about 3 years of age. The preschool period covers 3 years old to 6 years old. Middle childhood covers 6 years old to 12 years old, and then adolescence we consider to be through 12, from the age of 12 through 20. We used to consider adolescence over at 18 when you became a legal adult, but in decades past, psychologists have redefined this period specifically because human beings are living longer than we ever have before, which changes the rate at which we develop personally and the stages of life that we have. So throughout the life course, we're going to see that there are two kinds of change that a person undergoes, and there's continuous change and there's discontinuous change. And continuous change is going to be development that is gradual, and the achievements that occur at one stage are going to be comprehensive. So what that means is the growth and development that occur when I'm 3, well, that growth and development that occurs when I'm 6 and 7 and 8 is going to build on development that's already happened. It's continuous. There's also discontinuous change, and that's development that occurs in steps or stages at each stage of development, and it's fundamentally different from the last. It's not building on anything, it's unique in its own right. Okay, and that discontinuous change are going to be changes that occur at specific target ages and spans of growth. Both continuous and discontinuous development occur simultaneously throughout childhood. It's not a dichotomous issue. It's not binary. It's not one or the other. They're both happening at the same time because there's a whole lot of development happening head to toe, inside and outside, from the point of birth all the way until the point of adolescence, ending at about 20. And even after 20, we're still seeing brain growth, especially in males, occur all the way up until between 23 and 25 years of age. Okay. At 25 years of age, typically all brain growth is and cognitive growth is done. Doesn't mean we don't learn and grow through experience, but the actual physical structure of the brain is done growing around 25, and we have reached the apex of our cognitive physical abilities. Okay. There are things during development that are called critical periods, and these are specific times during development where a particular event has the greatest of consequences, and those are often permanent. So, an example of a critical period would be during the prenatal period when mom is pregnant. If she gets rubella, during week 11, there is a very high likelihood that her baby may be blind, that her baby may die. Okay. But if she leaves that critical period and she gets the same illness still during the prenatal period, but much later in the prenatal period, let's say at 30 weeks, there will be no impact on the developing fetus, right? So that's an example of a critical period, that there are certain windows that if something happens within those windows, the outcome is absolutely critical, unlikely to be permanent, okay? Which we're going to contrast with the concept of plasticity. And plasticity is the degree to which a developing behavior or structure is modifiable. So what this means is if a child goes into a stage of development and they're not hitting benchmarks, they're not hitting those steps that they're supposed to hit based on age, growth, and maturation, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's it, it's over, right? It doesn't mean that. Plasticity is something that is a concept that means, okay, so they didn't hit the benchmark at this stage, but they're going to hit it eventually, right? Just maybe not at the average age most kids hit it. You can easily overcome this deficit at one stage of development at another stage of development. So for example, there are certain things that there's what we call a high degree of plasticity. So for example, when my son was a baby, he wasn't sitting up at the benchmark period, which, of course, anytime babies and kids don't hit the benchmarks, all parents panic. I was no different. I, of course, panicked and had a freak out. But he hit it in the next stage, right? He was a little late on it, but he had plasticity. It's an element that has plasticity. It doesn't mean it wasn't critical. It doesn't mean that if he didn't sit up at exactly that benchmark month that he would never sit up. It just meant, okay, there's plasticity to this element of development. It will happen later than typical, and it will be fine, right? There's also what we call sensitive periods. And these are the optimal periods for particular capacities to emerge, where children are particularly susceptible to environmental change. So language development is a really strong example of this. There's a window for language development, okay? And in rare cases where we have seen that kids are not around other humans during this window of development, and this window of development typically occurs between the ages of 2 to 8, 2 to 10, if for some reason they're off the grid or they're just not around human beings to hear them speak, to see their mouths pronounce words, that is a sensitive period, and those children have a very, very, very difficult time after that about 10-year age mark ever developing language. It doesn't mean that they never will. It means that it's much, much harder, and they will probably not develop language to the extent that they would if they had been able to develop it during that sensitive period. Okay. Very rare, but it does happen, right? Occasionally, we had there what we call feral children, children who were abandoned somewhere in nature, who happened to survive in some capacity in the wilderness, but they were not around people in that sensitive period. And then when they finally are brought back into civilization and society, they have a very, very, very limited vocabulary, very limited ability to speak. Okay. I want you to know the term maturation. This is the process that occurs throughout childhood aging until the individual is done growing and developing. Okay, so we're going to use that term maturation pretty frequently throughout the course. We can't talk about any sort of psychological or physical development without talking about the concept of nature versus nurture. Nature is our genetic makeup. It's how our genetics influence our growth, our development, our behaviors. Of course, it has an impact, right? There's some things that genetics have a really strong impact over, the others that it has less impact over, right? So things like height, things like IQ tend to have a really strong genetic determination. But But there's also nurture, right? And those are going to be environmental impacts that influence our growth and our development. You can't separate one from the other. So if my genetics tell me I'm supposed to get really, really tall, but my environment doesn't support that, I don't get proper nutrition, my genetics will lose. They won't matter, right? Because without that nutrition, I can't reach my full genetic potential. So there's always the influence of both, the interplay of both. You can't isolate one for the other. And it's something that you need to keep in mind and in context as we move through all of our chapters.